So I did a video last week talking about the use of null tests when comparing how Tonex or neural amp modeler N.A.M compare to the real amp. This video upset a lot of people and there needs to be a few things clarified. Today I'm going to show you even more conclusive, different examples of why a blind test would be much more beneficial than utilizing a null test. Just to reiterate, the whole reason I did the original video is because I did a blind test comparing N.A.M and Tonex, and I had numerous people reach out to me and tell me that the blind test was useful because people had already proved that N.A.M was more accurate than Tonex using a null test. My point was that is impossible, but that was the entire point of the video. Nothing else, not to show that any sort of null test, even the one I showed in the video, was giving us any useful information. My claim in the video is that the blind test is actually more valuable than the null test. The null test is incapable of giving us any useful, meaningful information beyond telling us that two different audio files are different. It does not tell us how they're different or what's causing the difference, and it also doesn't tell us if that difference would be audible. One of the biggest complaints about my video were folks were saying, you used a null test to compare the Tonex version, the N.A.M version, the real amp to the Guitar DI, and that's wrong. I agree. That was the whole point. I was using an absurd example of comparisons of audio files we already knew were different. That's the only thing the null test can tell us with 100% certainty. So the point was, I can use a null test in this way from the file that actually nulled in the begin with. We added the different processing to it, and it still doesn't give us any meaningful information. I said that in the video. People chose to ignore it. Here is the clip from that video where I say this. And again, I actually think that this information is somewhat useless. All it's really doing is telling us that the real amp track is different than the source audio, as is the N.A.M track and as is the Tonex track. They're completely and wildly different than the source audio track. We already knew that going into it. So my use of that null test in that video was never, as some people claim, me using an incorrect null test. All of the null tests are incorrect to prove the point at hand, the point of this discussion. I'm not saying null tests are useless for everything. For this particular comparison, to prove that one is more accurate than the other, it is the wrong tool for the job. So what can a properly done null test tell us? Well, it can tell us the following things. If we compare two audio files and they null completely to silence, we know those two audio files are identical. There is no arguing that point. They're going to sound the same. What else can it tell us? Well, the two audio files can fail the null test, and then it tells us that they are not identical in some way. We don't know what way, but they're not identical, but they may still sound identical or sound the same. Or they will fail the null test knowing they're not identical and they will sound different. The null test will not tell us how or what is causing the difference, and it will not tell us if that difference is audible. And that's why I say that this is the wrong test for this job. And I'm going to prove that to you with some audio examples utilizing null tests today. One thing that I read a long time ago, and I wish I could give credit to who I read this from, but it was very, very useful in reference to the null test. And that is this. The sound of the difference is not the same as the difference in the sound. Read that again. The sound of the difference is not the same as the difference in the sound. So again, the null test can only tell us one thing with 100% certainty, that two audio files are identical. Beyond that, I say all bets are off. It can tell us they're a difference, where the difference is coming from, what's causing the difference, and if there's an audible difference, it does not tell us. We need to use a different method of measuring, whether that's our ears or some other tool, to be able to determine if there's an audible difference. So now let's go to Cubase and show you some specific examples which will prove everything that I just said. What I have started with here is the identical Guitar DI. So what I did is I took this Guitar DI I've been using all along. Let's take a listen to it. Nothing special about it. It's what I've been using in all of these tests, so I figured I would just continue to use it. But I took that, imported into Cubase, duplicated the file. Now, if I take one of these, come over and hit the phase button, now what should happen is these should null perfectly. And they do. Great. I'm going to just keep that running on loop. Now, here's how sensitive a null test is to changes, and why I say that just because two audio files fail a null test, or one in the case that we're talking about here shows that one is more accurate, and I put that in air quotes, you can't see me, is because the changes that can be causing the null test to fail or different results can be so minor that they aren't audible. So let's grab one of these DIs. I'm going to come into the EQ. I'm going to engage the EQ first of all. Now, there's not making any changes yet because we see it still passes the null test. Watch this meter right down here. So if I take this and go to a low shelf EQ, right? So I have this low shelf right here, and down at 20 hertz, so on the very edge of the ability of the human ear to even perceive sound, and well beyond the limits of, I would say, most people's monitoring systems. You know, it's most of our studio monitors and what we're listening to on home probably won't even reproduce these frequencies. I'm not going to talk for everybody, but that is likely going to be the case. So what if I come in here and I just add a 0.1 dB boost at 20 hertz as a shelf EQ? So all the frequencies below it might actually reach up into the frequencies slightly above that as well. We don't know, but 0.1 dB is probably going to be well out of the range of ability for the human ear to decipher. But watch what happens when I add that. The null test is now failed. Now, let's go take a listen to these two files. I will come over here, take the phase button off, mute one of the channels, and let's listen as I flip back and forth like this. And you tell me if you hear an audible difference, even though it's failing the null test, and the null test is showing there's a difference. I would have to say that nobody is going to be able to tell the difference in sound. So it failed the null test, and we say, aha, there you go, there's a difference. Well, yes, that's what the null test is designed to do. It's designed to tell us there's a difference. What it did not tell us, if we didn't know, if I hadn't shown you that I made this change, what the null test did not tell us is what was causing the difference, or if that difference would be audible. Let's even go more extreme here. Let's take this up to a point of half a dB, and we'll see how that affects the null. You can see it's even more dramatic now. Okay, that's fine. Let's come back and listen to hear if there is a difference audibly. I'm still going to argue that nobody is going to hear that difference. Let's even go to one more extreme just to show that something that makes it fail the null test quite dramatically. We'll go to the 1 dB boost on the 20 hertz shelf. We'll reset this. We now see we have quite a change here in what the null test is showing. But again, if we go back and say, let's listen to these. If somebody says they can hear that difference, I would want to be in the same room with them doing a proper ABX test on these two files to prove that they can hear the difference. But I think that that shows that two audio files can sound identical while still pretty spectacularly failing the null test. So right there, it tells us the only thing the null test tells us with any certainty is that these two files are somehow different. It doesn't tell us whether they will be audibly different or where that difference is coming from and what's causing it, which is the first piece of proof that shows the null test is the wrong tool for the job in comparing whether Tonex or N.A.M is more accurate when reproducing what the real amp is supposed to sound like. I have two more examples I'm going to show you to take this even further. So we're going to start off with the same two DI files we have, and we can take a listen to this and see again if I flip the phase on one of them, it passes the null test. So what we're going to do is now we're going to add two instances of Helix Native. I'm going to have just an empty preset here, and I'll duplicate that, slide it over to the other track. Now, just having done that, since Helix Native isn't actually adding anything to the processing, we still get this null, right? So there's no sound here. It just takes a second for the meters to kind of fall back down to where they have to go, but they are still nulling. So what happens though if I come to one instance of Helix Native to the amp cab block, and I'll just pick the Huot 100 and add that to that one, and then we'll open the other instance of Helix Native, add the exact same amp model with the exact same settings. we get no null anymore. So again, spectacularly so. We hear all that remainder and we could go, oh my goodness, they don't sound the same. But if we actually dive in here, we actually just get rid of the instance of Helix native, and we actually dive in here, we'll reverse that and listen back and forth to them. They sound identical and indistinguishable from one another, and there's good reason. I was talking years ago with some of the top sound engineers and designers at Line 6, and they told me what was going on here. The Helix uses some internal oscillators to do some of the processing for certain parameters. Basically, when you run two of these in parallel with each other like this and try to null them, the oscillators are out of time with each other. So they don't sound any different. It's just that since the timing even so slightly is out of sync with each other while they're playing, it's impossible to have these null even though they sound identical. And we can further illustrate that by exporting a mix of both of these. So this is what I'm going to do right now. All right, so now I've exported those two, and now we can listen to them side by side. No difference in sound. Why would there be? They've been processed by the same processor. But since that internal oscillator was very unlikely at the same point of its cycle, they're probably still not going to null. And we can prove that by flipping the phase on one of them while leaving the other as is. And you can see again here that we do not get a perfect null. It gets closer, but there is still a difference between them for the reasons I stated. But that tells us there is a difference. It doesn't show us what the difference is, what's causing it, or if it makes an audible difference. And I think we will all agree that in this case, there is no audible difference between these, further proving the point. The final way that I would like to show that utilizing the null test to compare how accurate Tonex or N.A.M is versus the real amp is by actually seeing if the real amp nulls with itself. Never mind the guitar DI, but the real amp. So I took the same DI guitar track that I was just using in the previous examples, and I reamped that through one of my guitar amps to get this. So something a little on the higher gain side of things. Now, I then immediately had another track ready to go, and I reamped it again seconds after the first time. So first thing I'd like to do is just let us hear both of these to hear if we can even notice a difference before we try anything else. Because here's the thing, we already know these are different. They were done at different times, so we don't know if there could be a difference between them. I don't think they're going to sound different. Let's listen. I don't think I'm going to get any arguments from anybody. They sound the same. This would be much like being in the studio and saying, hey, I want to punch a part in, a few seconds after we maybe did a take, and saying, well, we can't do that because the tone's going to be different. Well, no, the tone's not going to be different. It's through the same amp and the same chain. That's how these were recorded. They're identical. They sound identical, even though they were reamped at a different time. Then, in that case, if the null test is going to be of any use to us to compare how accurate Tonex or N.A.M is to this should be able to null with itself. So let's come over here. We'll flip the phase on one of these. There's no other differences between them. I've taken that low shelf out that we had before, as you can see here. And so now we will see if these null. They fail the null test spectacularly, even though they sound identical, as they should, because they're from the exact same source and the exact same processing, but done at a different time. These are failing the null test spectacularly, but they don't sound different. If someone says they do sound different, again, I want to be in the room with them when they do a blind test with it, an ABX test, to tell me with statistical certainty that they can tell the difference between these two. So if we come back over again, we'll flip the phase here. We will go back and forth. Let's listen to how they sound. So the null test failed. What did it tell us? It told us these were different. Of course, we went into this knowing they were different. I never would have performed a null test on these to begin with. It's ridiculous. It's going to tell us they're different. It's not going to tell us how they're different, what is causing the difference, or if that difference will be audible, therefore negating the null test as the proper test for the particular situation of seeing if N.A.M or Tonex is more accurate in recreating the real amp. All right, so there you have it. I hate to go on and on about this, but it's a very important point. Too many people are trying to use tools that are not designed for a particular job to prove certain so-called outcomes. Now, I want to say something else here. I'm not saying that the outcome that they are saying is being proven isn't true. It may very well be true. I'm not stating an opinion about that. That is irrelevant. The point is getting to the truth behind whether the null test is the proper tool to tell us that one is more accurate than the other. And I hope I have shown that it is simply not the right tool. The null test can be an incredible tool. As I've pointed out today, in the right situation, it does give us information that can be useful, but it doesn't give us any useful, meaningful information in the situation of trying to tell whether N.A.M is more accurate than Tonex or vice versa. It just doesn't do that. All it can do is tell us that the two audio files we're comparing are different, but we already knew that going into it. So I had some people say, yeah, but it confirmed that I heard a difference. And I simply answered, well, then you used your ears to hear that there was a difference. You didn't use the null test. If you already knew there was a difference, there was no point in doing the null test that is only capable of telling us one thing with 100% certainty, and that is that the two audio files are the same. We already know they're different going in. Therefore, we don't need the null test. So therefore, if we do a proper blind test, and I'm not saying for a second that I think a YouTube blind test is the proper blind test. We should be using high resolution files and a proper test method set up so that we can come to more accurate conclusions. So the whole point of this was to prove that the null test is the incorrect tool for the job that some folks are saying it is. I hope that clears it up. I am not speaking of this again. Anybody who has any questions can watch this video again very carefully. Don't twist what I'm saying. Just take it at face value of what I am actually saying in this video and the first video. And that's all I have to say on it. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. Please share this with as many people as you can. I do think it's important information for folks who are floating around the internet and taking certain things as evidence when they aren't actually that. So thanks so much for tuning in again. Please like the video. As I said, share it with as many people as you possibly can. And also subscribe to the channel. Hit the little bell notification to get notified when I put new content out. I'll be back really soon with some more. I'm going to leave you with the demo video for a couple of my tone model capture collections for both Tonex and N.A.M, and I hope you enjoy that on the way out. The links are below if you're so inclined and want to go grab a copy. Ciao for now.